Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another edition of No Talking Points, iPolitics signature podcast. I am your co-host, Marco Vigliotti, the editor-in-chief of iPolitics. I'm joined, as always, by my other co-host, Brian Storseth, the publisher here at iPolitics. You know, we say this every week, but I feel like this week it goes twice or triple as true as it usually is. We have a terrific show with a bunch of terrific guests. Aya Dufour is our major projects reporter here at iPolitics. Harshivam Bawa is the chair of the Young Professionals Network of Canada and a senior consultant with Temple Scott Associates. And of course, Max Fawcett is the lead columnist at Canada's National Observer. Thank you all for joining us. We have a really, exciting show today, talking a lot about energy policy. I actually wanted to start with you, Aya, because, you've been kind of on the ground with me on the Hill. And instead of, diving straight headfirst into energy topics, although I think they're just wrong parallel there, I did want to talk about what is kind of the big conversation on the Hill right now, and that is whether or not we're in a recession or not, and whether or not that actually matters, and who shoulders the political blame. You've seen the kind of headlines play out. What's your read of what we're seeing right now with this finger pointing between the Liberals and the Conservatives?
Yeah, well, when the R word showed its head in Parliament Hill last week, it's a very politicized term, and reactions were very quick. Emergency press conference by the Conservatives. And then we saw as well the US President Donald Trump retweet sort of that news of the weaknesses in the Canadian economy and repeating some of those threats to Canadian sovereignty, 51st state and all that. So obviously it's a word that carries a lot of weight. And I think in the media coverage in the days that followed the release of that information, the second consecutive term of negative growth in GDP, there was sort of like that more nuanced contribution from economic analysts. This is not the only indicator we should be looking at. And, a technical recession, like it can mean many things. And so a bit of that word of caution, I don't know if that word of caution has, slipped into the political discourse, but I guess we'll find out.
I mean, that's a good point in terms of the nuance there. Harshivam, what do you make of that, though? The fact that, we're kind of, to Aya's point, there's a lot of nuance there about whether or not we're actually in a recession, although there does seem to be this acknowledgement. I don't think anyone's disputing that things aren't great. At the end of the day, does it really matter whether, we are into that fabled, recession? Or, is it kind of obscure the fact that things aren't great right now? And a lot of, discussion seems to center on who's to blame. Is it the Liberals? Is it Donald Trump? Is it just, global disruptions or just, uncertainty caused by things like the Iran war?
Yeah, no, thank you, Marco. I mean, I would say off the top, like I'm no economist. So I'm the chair of the Young Energy Professionals Network. And, I think speaking from that lens specifically, I would say, what young people and young energy professionals care about is growth, obviously, major projects getting built so that we can have jobs in the future. So if there is, a slight decline, that means that maybe there's less investment, there's less capital, which means less, entry-level jobs for, young professionals to enter into the market or even to grow in a market in the energy sector or in general as well as comes to contributing to the economy. Young professionals have an appetite. They want to contribute to the economy. And if there are, recession talks or if there are signs that the economy is not going in the right direction, that essentially means that they would find opportunities elsewhere. And we do not want that. Canada has an energy superpower agenda. And if we want to deliver on that, that means that we need people to stay in Canada, work in Canada. And for that, we need to continue, attract investment, build projects. And I would say from that specifically, that is an important point from my perspective.
That's a good point in terms of the risk of, whether or not we're kind of deciding whether this is actually a recession or not. The concerns around investment fleeing the country because the softness in the economy. Max, I feel like, you've definitely been following this a lot more closely than all of us here, save for Aya, in terms of how this positioning around Canada being an energy superpower. To Rishma's point, if you look at that, if you look at the messaging from the PM, does it hurt him or does it really, potentially just like underscore how important it is, to advance that agenda in terms of expediting some of these big projects? Or is that in itself maybe a bit of a confusing or, untruth from the PM?
Yeah, I think it gives him more space to articulate the agenda that he's been bringing forward around, major projects, energy development, sort of pushing forward with building. I don't think that Canadians blame the federal government for a small technical recession that will, and I will take bets with anyone who wants to have this bet, that will be reversed in the next quarter. The impact on energy prices by the conflict in Iran will have a benefit for us here. We will be out of a technical recession next quarter. So this is a blip along the road. I think a lot of Canadians probably are surprised we weren't in recession earlier or deeper, just because of the way the Trump administration has been deliberately strangling the auto sector, the steel sector, basically every sector of our economy. I think there's an expectation that's baked in that this was going to happen. And so I think Canadians want to see progress. They want to see that those issues addressed. I don't think they want to see political leaders blaming federal policy for something that is pretty clearly an exogenous threat. I think when Pierre Poilievre goes out there and says, well, this is clearly all because of federal policies, and if I was prime minister, we would have no tariffs with the Americans, it sounds ridiculous to anyone who's paying attention, who isn't sort of deeply ensconced in the conservative base, because the Americans have said over and over again that tariffs are a central part of their approach to trade. That was reiterated by U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer recently, that they need tariffs. So, I think the risk here is actually for Pierre Poilievre in seeming too joyful in sort of pointing out this technical recession and in trying to blame it all on federal policy, when most voters who he needs to win over are just not there.
Well, I was going to say, Max, there was an exchange yesterday on the Hill where, it was put to him that, most Canadians probably don't blame Mark Carney and they blame Donald Trump for that recession. And he pointed out, well, we're the only G7 country in a recession. We also know that Mexico wasn't doing better, economically. Is that a fair assessment on your part? Or is he maybe, aside from Mexico, those other G7 countries obviously don't border the United States. So what's your read of his kind of rebuttal?
I think it's sort of textbook Poilievre, that he's always tactical, never strategic. And so, yeah, that's correct, that, Mexico is not in a recession. We are. That has a lot to do with the shape of our sort of respective economies. The things they export are far less, I think, exposed to the sort of big tariffs that we've been hit by. And the Americans they can't sort of turn away from agricultural imports, things like that, the way they can temporarily turn away from steel, auto, you name it. So, I think there is a tactical point that he's making that's true. But again, he looks like he's really trying to drive the wedge on it being all Ottawa's fault. And I don't think that's going to hold up over time, especially when, as I said, next quarter we get data that shows, we're out of a recession. It just looks like he's always trying to return to that frame of it's all these other guys' fault. And maybe that worked before Trump when the enemy was the Liberal government. But right now, for most Canadians, the vast majority of Canadians, the enemy is Donald Trump. And until that changes, his attempts to really point the finger at Ottawa, I think, are going to backfire on him.
What do you think, Brian? To Max's point, do you think this is a strategic miscalculation by Pierre? Or do you think it's a successful way to kind of hold the Carney government's feet to the fire?
Well, I think to Max's point, I think it's actually the Prime Minister that's in a tough spot on this. You can't, for the last 6 months, say we've got the best deal with the U.S. with the least amount of tariffs and now turn around and say tariffs are the reason why we're in a recession. I think it's less about, and I know the R words politically sexy for, especially when it comes to Parliament Hill and the National Press Gallery. But the reality of it is an economist definition, but it's a trailing indicator. I think when you talk to most Canadians, you would see that they feel like they'd be surprised if we weren't already in a recession. You have increasing debt, increasing inflation, decreasing Canadian savings, rising unemployment. Whoever you want to blame this on, Canadians are starting to really feel the squeeze. And the fact of the matter is, with oil exports being at all-time highs because of the conflict in Iran right now, it's the one thing that's kind of saving the economy. So I think it's the Prime Minister that's in a tricky spot on this. Pierre's good. Any opposition leader is going to run headlong into this and try to talk about the instability that it brings.
Well, I'm glad, everyone seems to be looking at the first question through the lens of energy, because I wanted to shift the discussion to that. Aya, we've been following this debate about a new pipeline pretty closely. And now we're hearing that there's some documents CBC has obtained showing possible different routes for, a new pipeline that would ship Alberta bitumen to the BC coast. We know, we're all well aware what some of the issues in terms of shipping through an area that would dump out into the area covered by the tanker ban. Then there's debate about twinning, TMX or potentially a new pipeline to the Lower Mainland. What's your read in terms of what's the most feasible of the options kind of being presented?
Well, I know we've been studying the map for months, trying to figure out what a possible exit point could be and how that would work with the port and the shipping routes that go through that area. And when we saw the reporting from CBC about Observatory Inlet and Nasoga Gulf being potential exit points, I was really surprised. Like, that was not on my radar. We thought that these were kind of like smaller areas where, big tankers would struggle to go into. It seems like Prince Rupert still definitely, from a shipping perspective, remains the most logical option, but definitely a politically fraught one with some, voiced opposition from First Nations in the area. That being said, like, a lot of the exit points going through the north anyway, going or sort of really close to Nishga territory, we know because they're involved with Sealisms that they do have like a favorable view of development, oil and gas. So I feel like that would track if it was a northern route. But I mean, the most telling part of the reporting by CBC was sort of towards the end there of that story, where he quotes like an Alberta consultant who's having these private conversations with community leaders in BC. And he says something along the lines of, I'm just here to gather your opinions. At this point, I don't even know if the route goes north or south. And, that in these consultations, they're talking more about like a general corridor as opposed to a specific route. I think that's very telling in terms of like where they are in the planning process. Like, I feel like if this is something you're looking to build by next year, you should kind of know where it goes by now. But so it was, kudos to the CBC for getting those documents. I don't know how, telling or representative they are of Alberta's ambition. This could eventually all be just kind of like some political gambit of, we're talking about the north because it's politically contentious, but our intention was always to go through the south. I mean, who knows?
Yeah, Harshivam, what do you make of that? The fact that, to Aya's point, we seem to really not even know what direction we're planning on this pipeline, and we have these aggressive deadlines being thrown out by Premier Smith. Is just, to Aya's point, is this telling itself, or what's your read?
I think, a lot of people in this space have talked quite extensively about how there is no proponent for this pipeline, private sector proponent. And I think that's the most telling signal. And based on the conversations in the industry, I don't think there is an interest to be a proponent for this route. I think the more realistic route, if there is one regarding a pipeline, would be the twinning of, TMX, which is already permitted. And that would make the most sense. But in terms of, building a new pipeline through the coast of BC, as long as there is the moratorium on tankers, I don't think it would sweeten the deal for a private sector proponent. But right now, there is definitely not a proponent, not a private sector player who's willing to take that risk on. I think that's what my read is. But I think in terms of a real route, I think the first deadline is October 1st to kind of get a proposal in of some sort. I think that might be playing into some of the separation talks. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But I would say until and unless there is a private sector proponent to get this through, I don't see a real pathway to get this done.
Max, what do you make of that point, though, that it seems like the private sector proponent just isn't there? And now, to Aya's point, we don't seem to really have a good sense of where you're leaning in terms of a new, is this a realistic proposition being put forward, or what do you make of it at this stage?
It's interesting. Harshivam makes a very good point that the private sector is probably not going to step up to build any of these projects because their upside is capped, right? They're a regulated utility. There's only so much they can charge in tolls. Their downside is potentially limitless in terms of court delays, legal challenges, you name it. And so you're going to see, I think, and I've always thought this, some level of federal or provincial involvement sort of to backstop the proponent, to get them to take their risk off the table so that they can do the thing they do well, which is just build the pipeline. I think it's interesting that we're finally seeing companies and the Alberta government realize that the shortest distance between 2 points is not a straight line. I made this point many times back when Gateway was being discussed, because I'm from that part of BC. I think engineers just kind of put a line over a map and said, how do we get from Alberta to BC? Let's go a straight line. And it didn't understand that there are Indigenous communities there that have different legal perspectives, different economic perspectives, and that is the real challenge, not the sort of physical geography. And so the routes that are being proposed take account of that. They sort of go around communities that are more hostile to oil and gas development and sort of orient towards the ones that are more open to it. I would be careful not to assume that just because a community supports LNG, it's going to support oil. The Indigenous communities have always been very clear about that. Including the Nishka, that gas is a different beast for them than oil. Gas evaporates if it's spilled. The danger to their traditional hunting and fishing rights is really not impacted in the same way that it is by an oil spill. And I worry that oil companies are making the same mistakes there that they made a decade ago. But, it is progress. And, I think ultimately the real choke point here is not, can we find a proponent and can we find a route? It's, can we get the upstream companies to commit to sanctioning an additional 1 million to 1.5 million barrels per day and finding the over $100 billion in capital to build that? I have never thought that they would be able to do it. I still don't think they're going to be able to do it. And that's sort of the choke point that no one is really talking about.
But what's the political risk there, Max, though, if, for the Carney government, if there is some like federal financing that comes to the table, does it not just make him look like a hypocrite, considering it seemed to be a pretty key condition that he and the government were talking about back in November?
I think the bigger risk for him politically is saying no to Danielle Smith. I think he understands that she is willing to use any leverage against the federal government. And I think his strategy all along has just been to continue calling her bluffs, continue saying yes, and get it to the point where it's the private sector that comes out and says, we can't build this. Not because the federal government is standing in our way, but because the economics don't make sense. And there's risk with sort of BC voters, more environmental voters. Maybe they go back to the NDP. We've yet to see any evidence of that, really. The polls keep showing a double-digit lead in BC. I think there's still a lot of room for him to make the case that it's more important to build than it is to block. And I think voters, by and large, are going to be on side with that.
What do you think about that, Brian? Do you think that's a fair read of the political situation right now?
Yeah, I think the political dynamic around this has definitely shifted over the last couple of years. At the end of the day, we saw the Main Street polling that not only showed a majority of support in places like Alberta and Saskatchewan for pipelines, but also a majority support in Quebec for this pipeline. So I think that politically, it's more doable for Carney. I agree with Max that the best thing the Prime Minister can continue to say is yes to Danielle Smith and make the energy sector and the province show its cards and prove that they can fulfill this and that it isn't the federal government inhibiting the province and Albertans from increasing their oil and gas exploration.
What's your take on that? I think it's a bluff that is, with some risks involved. Do you think that voters, are behind a plan to get a new pipeline built? Like, what's your read on in terms of the politics underpinning this whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think you saw a bit of that with the proposed regulatory amendments to sort of speed up project assessment, that it seems like the Carney government is doing whatever it can to be perceived as, not the reason that some projects don't go ahead. And the way that the agreement with Alberta was crafted is very much that, right? Like the federal government will declare it to be a national interest project. Like if it is, to Max's point, like if this does not go ahead, it's because of the economics, not because of the regulatory environment. And Carney has a big sort of point to prove on that, because that's been the constant messaging that we've heard from the oil patch, that we've heard from some of the business councils. Like the reason that we're not building things is because we have, too much red tape and it's making it too costly and uncompetitive to do business in Canada. And so that seems to be the Carney government's mission, like just make sure that you're removing all of the air from that narrative. How that's going to translate to a public understanding, I don't know. I think some of the people who view the Carney government as like the reason that we haven't, or the Liberals generally as the reason that we haven't had development in the last decade, are still going to believe that if this proposed project doesn't go ahead. So is it like a losing battle? Maybe.
Yeah, I'm curious what you think about that, Harshivam. It seems like my read, and I talked about this at length, and it was a question we put forward to the energy minister back in November when we were talking about this first MOU. Was like, is the government here trying to be a bit too cute, trying to put forward something where we might say yes if it's the right proposition going forward, but at the same time we don't want to look like we're too boisterous and too aggressive in championing this idea. Is this what's happening here? And if that is the case, if the government's trying to speak out of two sides of its mouth, is there risk, totally just stalling any private investment coming to the table, being like, we really don't know whether you want this thing or not?
I agree with Aya's point. I don't government does not want to be seen as the choke point, as Max mentioned earlier, for this project. But there's obviously risk. That you have Danielle Smith on one side, and you also have, Premier David Eby on the other side, who has said, he has not shown any interest, rather shown opposition to it, and very, staunch opposition to the project. And he has very clearly mentioned that, there is no appetite on their part to have the moratorium lifted. And I keep coming to that point. And I think still think the broader discussion is around, having a private sector component. And because there isn't one, and there hasn't been any interest shown from the private sector, rather, I wouldn't, without sounding, and with the fear of sounding as representing industry, or they're pointing out their view, which is not what I'm trying to do. But I don't think they have an interest in having that discussion just yet. Until, like, Max mentioned, there are some legal challenges. How would the Indigenous communities be involved with this? And rightfully so. I've heard the same messages over and over again from Indigenous communities in my past work as well. Like, just because they're supportive of natural gas doesn't mean that same community is supportive of oil as well. They could be. But from, as a young professional, I see projects, I'm for projects as long as it creates jobs, and as long as it provides an entry point for young professionals to continue building their careers and continue staying in Canada. And that means we have to attract investment. So I hope that's where that's how I would answer your question, Mark. I hope that's...
No, that makes sense. I just wondered, you bring up a target point. I wonder if, like, considering, this is such a heated topic, like, do we need the government, though, to be a bit more forceful to attract the investment, to send those stronger signals, being like, hey, I know you're likely going to get a lot of pushback on this. We need you on side before we even consider throwing some money in. And, Max brought up the debate over Northern Gateway. Is that, like, it lingering in your head, being like, I don't really want to be the whipping boy here. If I throw some money on the table, I need to know you guys are behind me and we're going to get this thing across the finish.
Yeah, I think more so that there is from the broader community, I think there was opposition to the public funding of TMX. So I've heard similar concerns from the community on that side too. Like, we don't want public dollars going to funding a big pipeline again. So in terms of attracting capital, I think there are several challenges that along the way before we can get to that point where we are able to bring it in. I think there are some challenges, again, with the moratorium, with some, legal challenges that you can get into with Indigenous communities. So I think attracting capital, yes, is important. I don't know if it will happen in the near term, with the the deadlines that have been set, the aggressive deadlines that have been set by the government, by the Alberta government. So it's a very tricky question to answer. Like, is the government the right partner, right people to bring the investment in? Is the federal government the right people to bring the private capital in? I'm not sure.
That's a good point. I want to get Brian and Max on this. Brian, you were with the last government that was trying to go build that Northern Gateway pipeline. Is that a fair read, though? That, I think, few people have brought this up now, that tanker ban being still in effect is going to, create a bit of maybe a chill on investment. Like, what needs to happen from this government if it is the government being the choke point, or not wanting to be perceived as the choke point? What do they need to do to get the private sector to start throwing in some cash, or start really signaling some interest?
Well, I think the reason why people are starting to say, okay, maybe this is a possibility, is because of political will and the perception that the Prime Minister has the political will and is willing to spend the political capital to push this through. But that, and that's kind of what our conversation encapsulates. We've touched on Section 35 and the duty to consult. We've touched on tanker ban. We've touched on some of the legislation that still remains in place today. These are all things that when you're a company, you have to take into account. And it's pretty hard to, I think, invest the billions and billions of dollars that it's going to take just on political will that the government's willing to give forward.
Max, I want to get you on that too. Like I was saying, are we putting the cart before the horse here in terms of what we need to do to get public investment? And if we do, does Carney need to, dispense with any cutesy language and just say, yeah, we're going to do everything we're going to do. We're going to get rid of that tinker ban, whatever we need to do to build this pipeline?
I mean, there's definitely a chicken and egg quality to this, right? That, you can't get the upstream investment till you build the pipeline, but you can't build the pipeline until you get barrels pledged to the pipeline. So, I think private capital looks at this and is just like, you guys need to figure your stuff out. And then we'll come in once things are clear. And the challenge when you're dealing with that part of BC is that the government can't provide that kind of clarity. There's nothing it can do to put its foot down and say, enough, we're just building, and there's nothing you can say to stop us. That was one of the lessons of Gateway. The Harper government really tried to put its foot down on opposition, on environmental protests, and it just blew back on them. It was a big part of the reason why Keystone got blocked by the Obama administration. They sort of put a magnifying glass on the industry, and it did not serve the industry's interests well at all. And so, I think TMX is the template here, unfortunately, or it's just the way it is, that you're going to need the government to be the proponent to get through a lot of that resistance. I've always thought that the southern route was the only one that made any sense. I still think that, in large part because if you remove the tanker ban, let's say, it doesn't remove the legal facts on the ground there. And there is a legal fact on the ground there that dates back to the late 60s. That would be litigated. That would go to the courts. The courts have pretty consistently ruled, especially when it comes to that part of BC where there's unceded territory. They've ruled on behalf of the Indigenous litigants. So, you're talking about years probably in the courts there, maybe losing that case. That is the opposite of certainty. That is what industry does not want. So I think if this succeeds, it's going to be TMX going south again. I don't know how the politics around that shake out. I think it'll be fascinating to watch. Will Greater Vancouver stomach another pipeline? What can the federal government do to offset that concern? But I think just from a sort of timelines and risk management perspective, you got to go south.
That's a good point, and it brings us up to our next topic. Once again, we see Saskatchewan reviving a long thought dead coal expansion or coal-fired electricity generation project. I'll start with you, Aya. We've talked at length about how this could potentially be totally inoperable with our clean electricity regulations, which we know are now suspended in Alberta as they got that carbon price deal and finally across the finish line. What's going on here? Is Saskatchewan calling the feds bluff on this? And if so, if Ottawa doesn't fight this back, is it the beginning of the end of any kind of serious national climate policy?
I mean, what is going on here is like the question, and the question I've been asking people on the Hill over the last week, because I can't seem to get an answer to this. We know that Saskatchewan has an equivalency agreement for the coal regulations. The coal regulations, by the federal government say we're going to, no longer phase out coal completely, unabated coal by 2030. And this is not a clean electricity regulation. Like, this is a much older regulation, dates back to 2012. It's already been tested at the Supreme Court. So it's when this equivalency agreement expires, what's going to happen? The Saskatchewan government has shown a bit of bad faith in terms of putting millions into this project, extending the life of these units way beyond what was initially planned in those equivalency agreements. It's a bit of a gamble, and I'm not sure how that's going to shake out. And what I don't understand is why the environment minister doesn't, intervene, ask for an injunction, ask for this to be paused. Why is it letting Saskatchewan invest all this money into something that could down the line, end up being a very much a wasted asset? And I haven't been able to get that answer. What I hear from the federal government is that, they prefer a collaborative approach. But, how do you collaborate with someone who obviously, doesn't want to collaborate and is, openly saying that they don't believe in your regulation and they don't believe it applies to them?
Yeah, I was going to say, Brian, to Aya's point, how do you negotiate with someone saying, we still don't think what you're doing is legal, despite the fact that they lost their challenge of the carbon price at the Supreme Court? I think maybe I confused a bit by talking about the clean electricity regulations, because I don't think this is what would be the huge thing that would sink this. I think it is the fact that carbon pricing is not in effect in Saskatchewan right now. So what do you make of the fact that this government continues to challenge the legitimacy of this? And at what point does Ottawa need to, smack them down? Or is this something that they're comfortable kind of negotiating off or letting them live as a non-carbon price regime?
Well, listen, that's a question for the government. And I know that you and I are holding them to account with that. I do think that it comes back to the first part of this conversation in this podcast. When you're sitting in a spot where the country is facing a recession, when the number one concern on Canadians' minds is the rising cost of groceries, when savings of Saskatchewan families is at the lowest levels in a decade. I don't think this is a fight that the federal government's looking to take on at this point in time, when Saskatchewan's, bringing these back online to help stabilize, as they're calling it, the grid itself. So, is there some points when it comes to the courts and the rest of this? Absolutely. Do I think the government's going to take the political approach and the more strategic approach of trying to negotiate this and probably look the other way until the economic situations change? I think the Carney government has tried to distance itself from the ideological environmental perspective of the Trudeau government. And So I don't think they're looking to mix that brand up at this point in time.
Yeah, I want to get Max and Harshivam on this, but I'll start with you, Max. What's going on? What is the reason behind this? It feels like Scott Moe is getting really everything he wants out of this government and doesn't really seem like he has to make any concessions. You want to talk about a sweetheart deal for Alberta. At least, there was something Alberta had to give to get some of these benefits. What's going on here with Saskatchewan?
Yeah, I mean, if politics is warfare by other means, then one of the first rules of warfare is you don't fight on two fronts. And so I think this is really just about focusing on Alberta, and because they are the bigger issue around emissions, around the economy. They're the tougher nut to crack here, and not letting Danielle Smith and Scott Moe saddle up together, which happened all the time under the Trudeau government in the Trudeau years. You notice that Scott Moe went with the prime minister, to China for the canola deal. Like, he's been very careful to keep feeding Scott Moe wins. And I think that will continue until he has cracked the nut that is Alberta and the separatist movement there. And so, it's not a lot of money to undo the refurbishment. It wouldn't be difficult to use some carrots to get Saskatchewan and Sask Power to switch over to gas from coal. Maybe there's a deal there around restoring the industrial carbon price, but using the revenues to, transition some of those facilities over to cleaner sources and eventually encourage Saskatchewan to do more on solar. There's a whole electricity play that's kind of happening behind the scenes right now when everyone's thinking about oil pipelines and the MOU. I think that is where the federal government is doing its most important work. And I think Saskatchewan can be a big part of that. But today is not the day to pick that fight.
Harshivam, what do you think about? Is this a smart strategic move to Mac's point of trying to have not trying to let those two provincial premiers team up on you?
I think for a broader discussion on this, I think is you cannot build you cannot retire older systems faster than you build the replacement systems. I think that's where there's a reliability conversation here that needs to be, I think is the bigger center point. I think that's primarily what I think is happening here. There is a focus on building AI data centers in Canada. Saskatchewan wants to be a big part of that. The electrification strategy came out. We want to double the size of our grid. How will we do that? Who is going to pay for that? So I think there's a reliability challenges, affordability challenges around the broader electricity discussion. And I think that is what is more at play here. Obviously, there are First Nations communities that are struggling with reliability issues, specifically in Saskatchewan right now. I've done some work in that space, and they need, some need natural gas, some need other sources of energy. Saskatchewan is definitely one of those provinces where there's a lot of need for electricity, but where is it going to come from? So I think this is more of a reliability challenge from a ground level, having enough supply for electricity for First Nations communities and broader public as well. You won't believe this. In some of the work that I've done last year, there was a study that was done specifically for First Nations on reserve and my previous role, which found that there are some communities that pay close to $1,000 a month in electricity bill, and so specifically in northern Saskatchewan, because they don't have access to reliable power, and they're relying on heating their homes using coal-powered electricity, which is super expensive, and they don't have any other option. So what they choose to do is essentially switch up their gas or their power supply during summer months so that they can save up for the extra cost that is going to be applied to their bills in winter, which is not a situation that you would think exists in Canada. So I think this is a broader reliability challenge and affordability challenge when it comes to energy and having that supply. As a young professional and other people that I've spoken to, we do understand the climate urgency, but we cannot do that by sacrificing reliability and affordability.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I know that affordability piece is always something that is always super important any time of the year, but especially as I feel like it's something that's on last government. So something that's top of mind for this one. I do want to shift gears a bit. I know that Dominic LeBlanc was in Washington yesterday. We got a new tariff threat today about, our inability to stamp out imports from countries that use forced labor. We are heading up to that July 1st deadline to state whether we want to stay in CUSMA or not. We've signed a letter saying we do. Let's renew this thing. I'll start with you, Brian. It just seems like ever since the fall when that deal fell apart, we've seen absolutely no progress in terms of trade negotiations. I think the PM was a bit more forthright in terms of what was going on, saying Mexico has technical issues, we have structural ones. At which point, do things really need to start moving on this? Are we comfortable with the status quo? Midterms are coming up. Can you kind of walk me through what you think the PM needs to do as we approach that July 1st kind of deadline where we think potentially the CUSMA talks will really hit into high gear?
Well, look, at the end of the day, it does appear that Canada is not in a rush to really get to a deal, because it seems like we don't feel like we're going to get a good deal for ourselves at this point in time. And so it seems like the Prime Minister is buying time in the negotiations, not being at the table. I can't say whether that's a good tactic or a bad tactic, but it does seem to be becoming increasingly obvious as we hear the Americans keep complaining that Canada is not coming to the table in good faith. Canada is not coming to the table. That's the tactic on their side. On our side, it seems like we're going to continue to delay, like you said, potentially until the president has less leverage after the midterms or closer to the midterms, and maybe the tables turn a bit there so that we have a better opportunity. But it seems pretty clear that the Prime Minister is saying, like, what structural issues that are being presented to us would not be something that we can sign at this point in time. So I think this is a game of chicken, and we're going to continue to see how it plays out.
I'll start with you. To Brian's point, if this is the game of chicken, it's got to be one of the longer ones. At what point if there is a point where this government needs to say, yeah, we're making some serious gains here, or the fact that, we haven't been hit with a new tariff, is that a victory enough? Like, kind of walk me through what this government, needs to do to signal the Canadians that has us underhand, because we have not seen really any momentum, any progress on these talks for quite some time.
No, we haven't. And the feeling of the environment is a bit different from a few months ago, where that sense of protecting CUSMA was, so heightened by the relentless, tariff policies. And now that we've had the war on Iran, it just feels like President Donald Trump has just so many other items that are more urgent on his list than CUSMA renegotiation. And I do think there would be an advantage from the Canadian perspective in waiting to see how that conflict plays out, and also waiting to see how the midterms play out, because, the political landscape might change completely, and it might just be easier to land a better deal in that context than it is right now, where it does seem like the balance of power that, it's Minister LeBlanc in Washington sort of pleading to be included in these talks, and the US just being very exclusionary and, using those, two-way discussions with Mexico and Canada kind of to their advantage, really, in terms of how this negotiation is going to play out.
Yeah, I'm curious, Max, what do you think? It seems like, I don't know, last month we were, just inundated with the Americans trying to do this good cop, bad cop routine, everything they're trying to throw to get Canada to come back to the table. Mark Carney seemed to tell them, we're coming back when we come back. Is that, maybe something that we should, pay closer attention to? Is it the Americans want us to come to the table because they want to avoid what they think we're doing, which is waiting until the by-elections, the midterms, and dealing with a potentially weakened Donald Trump?
Yeah, I can't imagine how difficult it is to set a strategy with this White House, because it is so schizophrenic in terms of how it handles every issue. You need to only look at the war in Iran. We're making a deal, we're not making a deal, we're making a deal. Everyone who has done an early trade deal with this administration has looked foolish for it. And so I think Brian is right that Prime Minister is playing chicken. I think he understands that we actually do have the high card here, in that, the American economy is not doing well. Gas prices are going to keep going up. They could settle this thing tomorrow in the Middle East, but the damage, I think the worst of the damage is still in front of us, not behind us. And then there's the midterms. So, for a guy who loves good headlines and needs a win, doing a trade deal with Canada is something that is attractive to him. And I think the Carney government knows that. And they may end up surprising us all with a deal, at some point this summer or fall ahead of the midterms. The one thing about the midterms I think we need to be careful with is the idea that the Democrats, if they control the House, if they control the Senate, are going to help us. We are really low on their list of priorities. The things that they care about, the things that are on their to-do list, Canada comes in, 154th. And so the idea that a Democrat Congress is going to force the Trump administration to be nicer to us, I don't see it. I think, the Biden administration, the tone was better, but a lot of the policies that they brought forward were equally unfriendly to Canada and to its industry. So, we're kind of on our own here, whoever's in charge of Congress. And I think the Prime Minister knows that. The one note I would make is that, if he is going to play the waiting game, if he is going to see who can endure more pain, he needs to tell Canadians that that's the strategy. He needs to be a little more clear that we are going to ask for sacrifices in order to get the best deal with the Americans. And I don't think he's done a particularly good job of preparing us for what could be to come. He's talked about, the economy in very glowing terms. He seemed to suggest that we're going to do okay. And I think Canadians are willing to step up and make a sacrifice, but you have to prepare them for that. You can't surprise them with it.
No, that's a good point. And Brian, you mentioned this a few months back when I think Stephen Harper was the one who said this during his event here or celebration in Ottawa, saying, I think Canadians are ready to deal with, some of the economic pain of reducing our dependency on the U.S. But we haven't heard that language from Mark Carney, to Mac's point, kind of dancing around it a bit. Harshivam, I haven't heard from you on this one. What do you make of where things stand with trade negotiations? What kind of movement do we need to see? Or, is Mark Carney, playing 4D chess here right now?
People in discussions with Mexico that are happening, and that seems to be somewhat alarming to some people. But I've heard some recent reporting that there are more, discussion points between those two countries to discuss. So just the fact that they are having those discussions doesn't necessarily mean that we are behind schedule. We are behind schedule in general on the trade negotiations, but just because they're having conversations with Mexico doesn't mean that we are in a bad spot. There are, and U.S. does have real pain points with Canada as well. Like they have said, on several occasions that the ban at LCBOs for the bourbon from Kentucky, that is real pain point for them. But at the same time, they're asking us to make concessions while not offering anything. So I think, being someone who represents or works in energy sector, I think energy is a bigger play here. I think Canada can really show US that. And I think there's also appetite from industry too. I don't think industry, yes, they want to diversify. They want to have more supply markets. But at the same time, they also want to continue working with US companies, give them our resources and help them get out of this the rut, so to say, that they are in as well in their economy. So I think other mentioned several points. I think it is a waiting game. There are several other things that are happening. I'm sure the U.S.-Iran war is on president's mind more higher on the list, and so are the midterms. And I think there might be if it doesn't come across just yet, there might be a bigger push from that side, from the Trump administration side, to get something done after the midterms, which are not looking very positive on their end.
Yeah, that's a good
Marco,
point.
I would just add, we've not only, one of the number one irritants that we've heard from U.S. officials is the tax on U.S. tech companies. And so we've not just sat back and kind of took a passive approach to this. It was only a couple of weeks ago, CRTC tripled the tax on Netflix, right? So, which I know the U.S. took note of and the administration took note of. And it in some ways, it's only added to the list of aggregants that are on the table. Now, I don't know if that's a strategic reason to push back. At the end of the day, it certainly seems to be going the opposite direction with us. And we'll see if that ends up being, as Max is saying, maybe in the best interest of Canadians over the summer. Maybe the administration ends up coming to a deal with us. But there's a lot of behind the scenes movement too.
I was going to say, Brian, one thing that was brought up to Cindy and I when we were talking to some people who were close or were involved in this discussion was this idea that Mark Carney, and Max brought it up too, how Mark Carney could offer a win to the president, considering where things stand, considering the weakened stature, and that might be an idea going into the midterms that the president can kind of pat himself on the back if we reach a deal there. You think that's still something that Canada has as leverage, that the fact that Mark Carney maybe has some more global gravitas than the president, and him coming to Washington, signing a deal, makes the president look like this great deal maker, as opposed to maybe anyone else who may not have the same kind of international prestige or clout right now?
There's a couple points to it, right? The one is you're not going to sign a deal. And I'm happy to see the Prime Minister not willing to sign a deal for the sake of signing a deal, because countries that have done that, to Max's point, have looked foolish afterwards. But you brought up the Harper speech, and fact of the matter is, kind of Max nailed that even a new president isn't going to necessarily turn around and say, oh, wait, all those changes to the auto sector, we want more jobs in Canada. So we have to make sure that we're not just so lazy. The U.S. is going to be our largest trading partner. It's the largest undefended border in the world. But at the end of the day, we have to make sure that we are working with other countries and a diversity of other countries to help offset our reliance on the United States.
Perfect. I know we're kind of running out of time, so I can kind of move us to our last segment. What we'd like to do here is give everyone an opportunity to talk about something that they're either looking forward to in the week ahead or something that maybe that caught their eye in the week that just passed. They wanted to kind of highlight. I'll start with you, Aya.
So we had the discussion paper about how the assessment of major projects could be sped up. Different measures that were proposed, some of them very significant, including special economic zones, which, the proposal on that was very light on details, but, potentially could have huge implications for how certain projects are proposed and developed. We've been asking the cabinet members about, are we going to see legislation soon? We need to see sort of the more fine print of this. And if legislation is tabled soon, is it going to be like a Bill C5 situation where this has to be passed within like a matter of days or weeks? Are we going to see that rush towards the end of the sitting is what we're paying attention to. The answers we've been getting so far have been a bit cryptic. We've heard that consultations are ongoing. We'll keep you guys posted when they're over. But this isn't a sort of like open consultation process. Like, some people have received a form that they filled and sent back. So you would think that they would have a sense of how realistic it is to table and pass legislation within a few weeks on this file.
That's a good point, Aya. And Mr. McKinnon was the one saying just that. Yeah, we'll keep you guys posted. The deadline's coming up soon. What about you, Max? What's something that you're looking forward to this week that's coming, or something that happened the week just past that you'd like to highlight?
Well, I'm here in Calgary, so of course separatism is on my mind. It blocks out the sun here. It consumes all oxygen. I thought it was very interesting that the premier basically came out and said we're working on a report that shows that separating from Canada would cost $400 billion. This is not new information for those of us who are on the Federalist side, but it is very interesting to see the Premier now making that argument. Of course, the separatist leaders reacted furiously to this. They are absolutely outraged that she is willing to do the math on promises, because they put out a document a few months ago that basically said no income taxes, everyone gets a free puppy, and you'll all be the handsomest versions of yourself. Like, it was just so unrealistic. And so it's good that she's fighting for Canada and that she's grounding the conversation in economic facts, but she's going to pay a price for it. And you already see the Jeff Raths of the world saying they're going to take her out. They're organizing. And it doesn't take much in the party that she leads to call a leadership vote. It does not take a lot of riding associations calling for one to make it happen. Jason Kenney found that out the hard way. And, I think there's a lesson here. I wrote a column about this recently for conservatives, which is y'all have to stop feeding your leopards, because they're going to eat your faces, right? We've seen this with Kenney. We're seeing it now with Danielle Smith. We kind of see it with Pierre Poilievre at the federal level. When you play to the base this aggressively, there is a price to be paid. And I think the bill is coming due for Ms. Smith.
That's a good point. It's going to be fascinating to see how that develops. Harshivam, how about you? What's something that you're either looking forward to or something that happened in the week that just passed?
Say it's a kind of mix of both. We've seen, several strategies recently that come out, a lot of, ambitious talks about getting things done. I think what I'm looking forward to is getting those things actually done. I would like to see some implementation now and not just ambition. I think there is definitely an appetite from the government to do that. But, as someone who cares about the future of the country, I would like to see that come to fruition now, come to implementation side as well. So I would say, yeah, that's what I'm looking forward to going forward, and hopefully some real action.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Brian, you always scold me for actually having the last word, so I'll go before you, just out of fairness. I mean, just someone has been buried kind of in the legislative calendar the past few months. We're in the final stretch. We have like 2.5 weeks. We're probably going to rise a bit early, maybe a day or two. I'm very curious to see what actually gets across the finish line. I assume the government's going to want the budget implementation bill, the spring economic update implementation bill through the finish line. But aside from that, there's some big criminal justice bills that aren't quite there just yet. And I do wonder at what point, the lack of seeing some of these big measures, become law, if that's going to start increasing the heat from, provincial premiers, especially around things like bail reform. So curious to see if, there's an aggressive final push to get things across the line. They don't really have the excuse anymore that they're a minority government. They got the majority. They can get some things, aggressively pushed forward, but they're running out of time. And like I said, Brian, I'll give you the final word.
Thanks, Marco. Look, I agree with Max. It was great to see Premier Smith out there grounding the economic conversation in some reality, because it was with social media today, it was becoming a little outlandish as to what the Leave forces were promising to people. But the people I'm going to look out for, because as you said, Marco, we're getting near that time when all the politicians are looking to get out of the legislatures, get out of parliament. And I think the award goes to Premier Ford for winning the race again this year, taking the next 5 months to talk to Ontarians, I guess. But what that leaves me to watch is Navdeep Bains. And it kind of takes the focus off the legislature. It's going to be harder for Merit Styles and the NDP to be able to use the legislature as its bullhorn and holding the government to account. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see the story that Navdeep Bains puts out there, the argument he makes to people in his party and the people of Ontario as to why he should be the leader of the Liberal Party. And I think he's somebody that you got to watch for. So I think this 5-month break is going to give the opportunity for media and Ontarians to kind of focus on a little bit on what that story is going to look like. And it's going to be interesting to see how Navdeep does with that.
That's a great point. It's another one of those races that we're closely following here. That's all the time we have in today's episode. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. And thanks, Brian, for co-hosting. As always, we'll be back next week with another episode. Thanks all for tuning in.